let's talk about Book of the New Sun, Volume 2, Sword and Citadel by Gene Wolfe. This is the second volume, the third and fourth books in the Book of the New Sun, which was his best known novel and the first section of his long 12 book, if you count these each as one book, the kind of small ones as one book, his 12 book solar cycle. And I've reviewed the first volume on this channel, and I'll go and have a look at that if you're interested. I really liked it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to give a completely non-spoiler review in terms of I'm going to summarise this in terms of just did I like it, was it good? Then I'll go into a bit more detail with light spoilers for Volume 1, Shadow and Claw. Not heavy spoilers, you know, it probably wouldn't ruin it if you listened to both end on end with it before reading, but just to warn you, I'll do that. I will read the blurb, which I don't think really spoils anything. Mostly because you know some of this from within the first couple of chapters of the first book, Shadow of the Torturer. Exiled from his guild, you know that from page 1 or 2, the former torturer's apprentice Severian is now the lictor of Thrax, a city far distant from his home. But it is not long before he must flee the city too and journey again into the world. Embattled by friends and enemies alike, pursued by monstrous creatures, Severian must overcome hitherto unimagined perils as he moves closer to fulfilling his ultimate destiny. You know about this destiny of his from, again, the first chapter of Shadow. So that is a blurb that does not tell you anything false. In fact, summarises a lot of true things about the book in terms of its rough lineaments, but is basically a false summary in the sense that the things that are important about these books, the reasons you'd read them, are not summed up there. That sounds like a plot summary. This is a plot book. There's this amazing arc of plot. And though there is, in many ways, an amazing plot, these books are not like those books. You know, they're not plot books in that sense. I really loved the first two books. I thought Shadow of the Torturer, book 1, was very good. Claw of the Conciliator was even better, very nearly perfect. Here, the headline is, I think, Sword of the Lictor is the weakest. I'd give it a 4.5 out of 5 or something. Still excellent. And Citadel of the Autarch, 5 out of 5, and I'd give it a 6th star if I could. I thought it was so good. So good. These are very, very good books. Basically, they're set in a dying Earth context where there is sort of fantastic and sci-fi elements living side by side. It's sci-fi, but with a sort of sometimes a medieval or fantasy patina, or sometimes a sense of maybe there are fantasy elements in this world, you don't know. And Severian, the narrator, is, and again this is a chapter 1, possibly page 1 and 2 revelation. Severian is the narrator. He is telling the story of essentially an arc towards a path of destiny, from being a callow torturer's apprentice to in the guild of seekers for truth and penitence or something like that, and on his way to wherever he's going. And he is potentially, there are a few things you learn that he has not. He doesn't. I don't think he says in chapter 1 he has a perfect memory, but rather that his memory in some sense never loses anything. But he also, it's not clear how reliable he is as a narrator, and he is potentially insane. There's all these things going on where you're not sure about your narrator, and he has this strange story of going around this in a picaresque. There is an intentional pastiche of Vance. It is a very funny thing to read something which is pastiching something that's only 30 years old. It's, I guess you see it with that kind of Lord of the Rings kind of books where you're like, this is actually a fairly modern thing with but this is not a parody, it is a pastiche. It's a pastiche of books that are very ornamented and baroque, but which have an anarchic, picaresque mode. The heroes go around, they're doing all kinds of crazy stuff, and that's really the same here, in the sense that Severian goes around the world finding out all kinds of things, and it is baroque and grotesque. It's not anarchic, it's not slightly nihilistic like the Kugel books, which I had issues with the two Kugel books of Jack Vance's Dying Earth. It is a much more philosophic and spiritual set of books, a much more reflective set of books. The pastiche is interesting precisely partly because of that, because it's almost like an answer to Vance in some ways. It's beautifully written, though sometimes, and it's not confusing to read in terms of the prose. The prose is beautiful, interesting, easy to read, vocabulary-wise, Wolfe picks a lot of either real old words or mashed up Latin root words. You know, he finds Latin and Greek roots for things and turns it into a new word. So there is a linguistic challenge, but which you kind of can just flow with a lot of the time, especially on a first read. So I wouldn't worry about that. It's the thing that is complicated is knowing whether or not what you're reading, is it real? How real is it? What's really gone on? Who are the characters involved and what are their motives and their background? Sword of the Lictor, book 3, which is the first of these ones. I think it starts a little slow, and I think that will probably end up being very controversial, but I think it starts to real Wolfe fans. But it starts off a little slow, and it has some really interesting emotional beats in it that are very important, which really feed into the mysteries. But pacing-wise, it was certainly the slowest I found any of the 4 books. The pacing and the sort of emphasis and the feeling of importance really increases in the back end of Sword. And then Citadel is it continues more or less. It's almost all, you know, like top speed. I don't mean top speed in terms of everything happens quickly and you don't know what's happened. What I mean is the pacing is elite pacing. It is absolute top tier pacing. This is a powerful second half of the whole Book of the New Sun. It rises to a crescendo, which is, it has aspects of something like a spiritual experience. It's a very, very powerful experience. It was for me a very emotional experience, intellectually very powerful as well, beautifully written, aesthetically effective. A big theme of Wolfe's writing across all of his books really is about the intersection of identity and reality, memory and sanity, perception. You see that the Lictor books are about a soldier who has lost his memory. Identity and reality are big themes in Fifth Head of Cerberus. And Book of the New Sun is all of that on full throttle. It's often baffling, often makes you ask, did it actually happen? What is it I'm seeing? What's going on with Severian? Severian continues on his journeys, and we see a vast array of circumstances and settings and characters described by Wolfe in massively different circumstances, massively different situations, and he weaves it all together into an eminently satisfying conclusion. It is complex but worth it. Basically, it is more complicated as a book than Lord of the Rings, but if you liked Lord of the Rings, you actually might like this. It's a complicated question, but I'm saying in terms of the longer fantasy sci-fi epics. In terms of the type of sci-fi it is hard sci-fi, but not as you know it. What I mean is it has pretty serious sci-fi thoughts and concepts in the background that are there, but which are mysteries veiled and never fully revealed in this book. Revealed more and more over the course, I understand, not that I've read them all, of the solar cycle. So I would recommend it. I think if you like complicated books, if you like intelligent books, if you like big sci-fi, I'd highly recommend it. It has a claim, I think, to being the best long sci-fi novel ever written. By that I mean Dune isn't that long, to make the point clear. In terms of, oh, this is an epic length book, more like your big fancy doorstoppers, this has a claim to being the best sci-fi book ever written at that length. So now I'm going to give just maybe a few more spoilers on books 1 and 2 as I go now, for a similar length of time. As I say, I'm not going to try to rip anything completely apart and completely ruin the first 2 books for you, but just as a warning, these books dig deeper and deeper into the various mysteries from the first volume. Severian's memory, and part of why there are all conflicting strands in his memory, on the nature of it, identity, dealing with Dr. Talos, Baldanders, Dorcas, the Autarch, in the end Severian himself. Who are they? Why are they? What are they? Vodalus, who's Vodalus? Agia. Agia, by the way, continues to be, in this book where she comes up, one of the most baffling and, in a good way, that at least satisfying characters. What I mean is, the engagement with this character who jars with other things you're doing. Who is Master Palamon? What's his background? All these kinds of things. The world building here is enlightening. It is more open than you'd expect from Wolfe, I think, than the other stuff I've read by Wolfe, but it still requires effort. It nonetheless is paying off mysteries. Cacogens, what are they? What do they want? The chthonic forces in the world, how do they relate to human ambitions? And that connects into important stuff I talked about in the first review, where, like, what is what makes Severian saner, what is sanity, and how human contact, human relationship interacts with that, or is important for that. That is, again, sometimes framed differently, very important here. Not always framed differently by any means to the first books, but sometimes framed differently. But human identity, human decency. The characters, they often appear in frankly confusing, weird situations that make you wonder about Severian sanity again. They continue to be enriched, especially Severian. There is a strange way in which these books are idea books. These books are concept books. They are, in a loose sense, plot books. They are, in a loose sense, world-building books. I mean, no, loose sense, they're actually very much world-building books. But I think there's a way in which you could say they're, above all else, character books, because not in the way you're used to, and not in the sense that we are thinking about when you read a Joe Abercrombie book, for instance, where you're like, oh yeah, look at these wonderfully developed viewpoints, and I hear their voice and I get their stakes and I care about them. Yeah, it's kind of true for Severian, but the big thing is the very way in which the narration works or intentionally doesn't work, the very way in which other characters are brought into the world and developed, is very different to those other books, and adds a very different layer or twist to this narration, kind of to the character narration style, which makes it a character book. There's this layered building of characters that continues throughout all the 4 individual books, often bits at a time, scene at a time, scattered amongst a 300-page volume, sub-book of this, with other layers intentionally hidden behind the text, which you have to guess at, which you have to draw out, bits you have to connect across, which aren't necessarily even about the same character, but which cast light on a different character. And there's things that you won't realise on your, a first glance, and I'm only realising listening to podcasts, like all of the human-oriented characters are named after saints, whereas all of the transhumanist and chthonic aligned characters have more have fictional names, literary names. Wolfe really is masterful at, well, that's a small detail, but it's a good example that Wolfe is really masterful at threading stuff together over the books, drawing threads together all the way from the start, from Severian in the graveyard with Vodalus, all the way to the final arc here, both the kind of crescendo conclusion and there's kind of a coda at the end. There's an insane interconnectedness, much deeper, much more in-depth than most books I can think of. It apparently rewards repeated rereading. I can believe that. I'm already thinking about it a lot, still thinking about it a lot. I remember when I talked about the first volume with Liam, that was a big thing we talked about, was how much it made us think and left us thinking. It's comparatively big community talks about it, and I think that's indicative, and talks about it in depth, and that's indicative of the kind of depth there is in these books. I finished this excited to continue on into the solar cycle, to eventually reread these. I will get the other, Earth of the New Sun, the 2 collections of Book of the Long Sun and the 3 individual volumes of Book of the Short Sun. I will read all those, no doubt, and I've also got Lictor to read. I've read Fifth Head of Cerberus and this by Wolfe, and I think a short story or 2 as well. That was how good it was that I'm committed now to, this was 4 books, I'm committed now to 8 more books. This resolves, or this volume, so many of the threads in such a powerful way, in a transcendent, aesthetically satisfying way, that it's hard not to rank this as one of the great novels. It has its complexities, it has moments which are on their own. If you're reading them as 4 individual books rather than as one big book, you could pick apart, I didn't like the way this sub-book did as much. But maybe the thing to think about is that's the same as splitting up the Lord of the Rings volumes. And as a whole, I think it has to stand as one of the great sci-fi fantasy achievements of the 20th century. For me, I guess a top 10 in speculative fiction. It's an incredible, strange, confusing book, and with a little effort, it could be the book of your life. And so, if any of that sounds good, I'd start obviously with Shadow and Claw, and I'd highly recommend Sword and Citadel. Liam and I will talk about that book at some point on his channel, Liam's Lyceum, and I will certainly continue on with the Solar Cycle. If you have finished Book of the New Sun, tell me what you thought in the comments, and tell me if you like the rest of the Solar Cycle. Till next time.